Concrete scraped against Jordan Hayes' cheek as a burly police officer drove a knee straight into his spine. Officer Brian Keller smirked, absolutely certain he had just cornered another defenseless kid in the wealthy suburbs. He had no clue the teenager he was brutalizing was actually the only son of the United States Secretary of Defense. Those headlights tearing down the dark street weren't local backup. They belonged to heavily armed Secret Service agents whose sole mission was to protect that boy. Keller thought he was untouchable, but karma was speeding toward him in an armored SUV. The streets of Potomac, Maryland, were supposed to be quiet that evening. It was the kind of ultra-wealthy enclave where the only sounds were the soft hum of central air conditioning units and the distant splash of pool filters. Or iron gates stood like silent sentinels guarding multi-million-dollar estates. Jordan Hayes was just trying to be a normal kid. Recently, normal had been completely stripped from his vocabulary. His father, Richard Hayes, had just been confirmed as the United States Secretary of Defense, plunging their family into the highest echelons of Washington, D.C.'s political and security apparatus. Jordan's life was now dictated by itineraries, threat assessments, and the constant suffocating presence of the United States Secret Service. That evening, however, Jordan had begged for a shred of independence. He just wanted to walk a few blocks from his friend Tyler's house back to his own heavily fortified residence. He wanted to feel the cool night air without the suffocating confines of an armored Chevrolet Suburban. His lead protection agent, a stoic, broad-shouldered man named Agent Michael Reynolds, had reluctantly agreed on one condition. The detail would shadow him. They would hang back in an unmarked black Ford Expedition, keeping a discreet distance, close enough to intervene, far enough to let a teenager pretend he was just walking home alone. Jordan wore a faded gray hoodie, the hood pulled up against the evening chill, a pair of worn-out sneakers, and loose athletic sweatpants. To anyone who actually knew him, he was an honor roll student and a varsity track star. But to Officer Brian Keller of the local county police force, Jordan was a statistical anomaly that didn't belong. Keller had been riding a patrol car for years, a career defined by stagnant promotions and a growing bitter resentment for the world around him. He fancied himself the ultimate protector of Crestview Estates, a self-appointed gatekeeper who decided who belonged in the wealthy neighborhood and who was a threat. His personnel file was a graveyard of excessive force complaints and racial profiling accusations, all miraculously swept under the rug by an old guard police union that protected its own. Cruising down McGraw Boulevard in his patrol cruiser, Keller's eyes scanned the manicured sidewalks. It was a slow night, the kind that made his trigger finger itch with boredom. Then his headlights caught the reflective material on the back of Jordan's sneakers. Keller slowed the cruiser, his eyes narrowing. A young black male, tall, wearing a hoodie, walking through a neighborhood where homes cost millions. In Keller's prejudiced mind, the math was simple: burglary suspect casing the neighborhood. He didn't see a kid walking home from a study session. He saw an opportunity to exercise his authority and remind someone of their place. Keller tapped his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4 Bravo. I've got a suspicious person on foot eastbound on River Road near the intersection of Fox Run. Going to make contact." "Copy for Bravo. Need backup?" "Negative," Keller sneered, accelerating slightly to close the distance. "I can handle this one." A short distance behind them, idling quietly with its lights completely blacked out, the unmarked Ford Expedition rolled forward. Inside, Agent Reynolds tapped his earpiece. The encrypted radio channel was silent, but the atmosphere in the SUV was instantly electric. "Local PD is moving in on Falcon," the driver, Agent Emily Vargas, murmured, using Jordan's official Secret Service code name. Reynolds leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the taillights of the police cruiser ahead. "Hold position, Emily. Let's see what local law enforcement wants. If he asks for ID, Jordan knows what to do. Keep a low profile unless the threat matrix changes." But Reynolds' grip on the door handle tightened. His gut, honed by tours in Baghdad and a decade on the Presidential Protective Division, was telling him that Officer Brian Keller was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The police cruiser suddenly swerved toward the curb, cutting off the sidewalk and forcing Jordan to stop dead in his tracks. The blinding white beam of the cruiser's mounted spotlight clicked on, hitting Jordan square in the face. Jordan flinched, raising a hand to shield his eyes from the blinding glare. His heart gave a sudden jolt, but he remembered his father's advice and the countless briefings from Agent Reynolds. Stay calm. Keep your hands visible. State your name. The heavy thud of the cruiser door slamming shut echoed through the quiet street. Officer Keller stepped out, resting his right hand casually but purposefully on the butt of his service weapon. "Hold it right there, buddy," Keller barked, his voice dripping with aggressive authority. "Take your hands out of your pockets." Slowly, Jordan complied, pulling his hands from his hoodie pockets and keeping them by his sides, palms open. "Is there a problem, officer?" His voice was remarkably steady, though inside the adrenaline was beginning to spike. "I asked the questions," Keller snapped, stepping into the halo of the spotlight. He looked Jordan up and down, his lip curling into a sneer of contempt. "What are you doing walking around here at this hour?" "I'm walking home," Jordan replied simply. "I live a few blocks away." Keller let out a short, mocking laugh. "You live around here, right? And I'm the King of England. Let's see some ID now." "I don't have my wallet on me," Jordan said, which was the truth. When you have a federal detail following you, you rarely need to carry cash or a driver's license just to walk to a friend's house. "But my name is Jordan Hayes. My address is—" "I didn't ask for a story. I asked for ID!" Keller shouted, closing the distance until he was less than 3 feet from the teenager. He jabbed a thick, calloused finger into Jordan's chest. "You think you can come into this neighborhood, case these houses, and lie to my face?" Jordan took a half step back, creating space. It was a defensive, non-threatening movement, but to a man like Keller, any retreat or resistance was a direct challenge to his absolute authority. "Officer, please don't touch me," Jordan said, his voice dropping an octave, finding a firm, assertive tone. "I haven't committed a crime. I have no obligation to provide identification if there is no reasonable, articulable suspicion that I've committed a crime. I'm just going home." It was the absolute worst thing Jordan could have said to a cop like Keller. Hearing a young black teenager calmly and accurately quote his Fourth Amendment rights didn't earn Keller's respect. It enraged him, his ego, fragile and bloated, fractured instantly. "Oh, we got a constitutional scholar on our hands," Keller hissed, his face turning an ugly shade of crimson. He unclipped his handcuffs from his belt, the metal rattling menacingly in the quiet night. "You want to play lawyer? We can play lawyer down at the station after I book you for loitering, resisting arrest, and whatever else I find in your pockets." Down the street, inside the blackened Ford Expedition, the tension had reached a boiling point. Agent Vargas had the SUV in drive, her foot hovering over the accelerator. Through the high-powered night vision binoculars, Agent Reynolds was watching Keller's aggressive body language. He saw the finger jab. He saw the handcuffs come out. "Local PD is escalating," Vargas stated sharply. "He's unholstering restraints. Subject Falcon is complying, but the officer is agitated." Reynolds' jaw set into stone. "Light him up. Let's shut this down before this idiot does something he regrets." Vargas reached for the console, her fingers brushing the toggle switches for the concealed red and blue strobes hidden in the SUV's grille. But before she could flip the switch, the situation on the sidewalk went from a tense confrontation to a violent assault in the blink of an eye. Keller lunged forward, grabbing Jordan roughly by the collar of his hoodie. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Startled by the sudden physical violence, Jordan instinctively tensed his shoulders and pulled back. "Hey, I told you I live right down the street. My father is—" "I don't care if your daddy is the mayor," Keller roared. Keller didn't give Jordan a chance to finish his sentence, taking Jordan's instinctual flinch as resisting arrest. Keller's training, or rather his corrupted version of it, kicked in. With a grunt of exertion, Keller grabbed Jordan's right arm, twisted it violently behind the teenager's back and kicked his leg out, sweeping Jordan's feet right out from under him. The heavy, sickening sound of flesh and bone hitting concrete echoed through the silent neighborhood. Jordan gasped as all the air was violently forced from his lungs. The side of his face slammed into the rough pavement, scraping the skin raw. Before Jordan could even register the pain, Keller dropped his full weight down, driving his knee sharply into the center of the teenager's spine. "Stop resisting! Stop resisting!" Keller yelled, the standard script of a bad cop justifying his own brutality. Even though Jordan wasn't moving at all, Keller reached for Jordan's wrist, ready to slap the steel cuffs on him and drag him to the cruiser like a trophy. He felt a surge of triumphant adrenaline. He had put the thug in his place, but the triumph lasted only seconds. It was interrupted by the deafening, monstrous roar of a powerful V8 engine. Keller jerked his head up just in time to see a massive, blacked-out Ford Expedition jump the curb. The heavy armored vehicle didn't just pull up. It launched toward him like a missile, tearing up a pristine strip of expensive sod before slamming to a halt a few feet from the front bumper of his police cruiser. Before the Su-5 had even completely settled on its shocks, the doors exploded open. "Federal agent, step away from the protectee! Step the hell away now!" The voice that boomed across the lawn wasn't a request. It was an act of war. Agent Michael Reynolds and Agent Emily Vargas poured out of the vehicle with terrifying synchronized speed. This wasn't local backup. This was the elite tier of the United States federal government, moving with the lethal precision of apex predators protecting their charge. Both agents had their weapons drawn. Glock 19 Kes leveled directly at the center of Officer Keller's chest. The red dots of their laser sights painted a terrifying constellation right over the local cop's badge. Keller froze, his knee still pressed into Jordan's back, his brain completely short-circuited. He looked at the two figures advancing on him. They weren't wearing police uniforms. They were wearing dark tactical jackets with heavy, undeniable golden shields hanging from thick chains around their necks. United States Secret Service. "I said get your hands off him!" Reynolds roared, closing the distance in 3 massive strides. He didn't wait for Keller to process the command. Reynolds grabbed the back of Keller's heavy-duty belt and violently hauled the officer off the teenager, throwing him backward against the side of the police cruiser. Keller's head bounced off the metal of his own door. "Hey, what the hell are you doing? I'm a police officer. I'm making an arrest," he stammered, his voice cracking in sheer panic. His hand instinctively twitched toward his own holster. "Touch that weapon and I will end you right here on this pavement," Vargas warned, her voice deadly calm, her Glock unwavering and pointing straight at Keller's face. "Keep your hands flat on the hood of your car. Do it now." Keller, trembling, slowly raised his hands and placed them on the cold metal of his cruiser. His mind was spinning wildly. Secret Service protectee? What the hell was going on? Reynolds dropped to one knee beside Jordan, his entire demeanor shifting from lethal enforcer to frantic guardian in a heartbeat. "Falcon, talk to me. Are you injured? Where does it hurt?" Jordan groaned slowly, pushing himself up onto his elbows. His cheek was bleeding, a nasty abrasion blooming across his jaw. He reached up, rubbing the back of his neck where Keller had twisted him. I'm okay, Michael. He just knocked the wind out of me. My shoulder hurts." Reynolds gently helped the boy to his feet, shielding Jordan's body with his own. He keyed his radio, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "Command, this is Detail Leader. Falcon is secure but has sustained a physical assault. Requesting a medical team to our location immediately and get the director of the FBI and the chief of the county police on an encrypted line. We have a massive situation." Keller stood by his cruiser, the blood draining completely from his face, leaving him pale and clammy. He watched the massive federal agent carefully check the black teenager for injuries. He heard the code name. He saw the genuine terrified reverence in the agent's eyes as they looked at the boy. Who is he?" Keller managed to whisper, his voice shaking. Agent Reynolds turned around slowly. The look in his eyes wasn't just anger, it was the promise of complete and utter destruction. "That," Reynolds said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the cool night air, "is Jordan Hayes, son of the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America. And you, officer, just assaulted a federally protected person." Keller felt his knees buckle. The handcuffs slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly onto the concrete. The sound was deafening. It was the sound of his career, his freedom, and his entire life shattering into a million irreparable pieces. The karma hadn't just arrived. It had come wearing a federal badge, and it was about to bury him. Within minutes, McGraw Boulevard was unrecognizable. The quiet, affluent street had been transformed into a blinding, deafening fortress of law enforcement. But it wasn't the local county police who controlled the perimeter. It was the federal government. 4 more black Secret Service Suburbans had converged on the location, effectively sealing off the block in both directions. Heavily armed counter-assault team operators in full tactical gear established a hard perimeter. Their patrol rifles slung across their chests, eyes scanning the dark tree lines. Officer Brian Keller was no longer a symbol of authority. Stripped of his service weapon, his radio, and his taser, he sat on the curb next to the rear tire of his own cruiser. His hands were zip-tied behind his back, a precaution Agent Reynolds insisted upon after Keller had twitched toward his belt. 2 local county cruisers had managed to pierce the outer perimeter. Sergeant Tom Hendricks, a veteran of the local force and Keller's shift supervisor, had stepped out of his vehicle with his chest puffed out, ready to defend his officer against what dispatch called a jurisdictional dispute. Hendricks had marched up to Agent Vargas. "Look, lady, I don't care who you work for. You don't disarm a local officer in his own—" Vargas hadn't even let him finish. She simply raised a hand, pointing a laser-steady finger at Hendricks's chest. "Sergeant, you are currently standing inside a federally secured zone protecting a Tier 1 principal. If you take one more step, I will have you detained for interfering with a federal protective detail. You will stand by your vehicle. You will not touch your radio, and you will wait for your chief. Do you understand me?" Hendricks had looked at the tactical operators, looked at Keller shivering on the curb, and swallowed hard. He retreated to his car in silence. On the sidewalk, a Secret Service medic was shining a penlight into Jordan's eyes and carefully cleaning the abrasions on his cheek. Jordan was quiet, the adrenaline crash leaving him shivering slightly in the crisp night air. Agent Reynolds stood shoulder to shoulder with the boy, a silent, immovable wall. Then the heavy thrum of approaching helicopters vibrated in the air, followed immediately by the unmistakable wail of a full, unrestricted police escort. A motorcade of 6 vehicles, led by 2 D.C. Metropolitan Police motorcycles and anchored by a massive armored Cadillac limousine, tore down the street. It bypassed the local police entirely, the vehicles sliding into a synchronized defensive diamond formation around Jordan and the agents. The doors of the limousine opened before it even came to a complete stop. Richard Hayes, the United States Secretary of Defense, stepped out into the chaotic flashing lights. He was a man who commanded the most powerful military apparatus in human history, accustomed to briefing the president on global threats. He was imposing, sharp-jawed, and wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that now felt entirely out of place on a suburban Maryland sidewalk. He didn't look at the police. He didn't look at the agents. He walked straight to his son. "Jordan," Richard said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that instantly cut through the noise of the idling engines. "I'm okay, Dad," Jordan said quickly, trying to stand up straighter, wincing slightly as his bruised shoulder shifted. "It looks worse than it is." Richard gently cupped his son's face, inspecting the scraped, bleeding skin on his cheek. The secretary's jaw muscles twitched. The cold, calculated intellect that made him a legendary strategist was suddenly violently eclipsed by the raw, terrifying fury of a father. Richard turned slowly. His eyes bypassed the Secret Service agents and locked directly onto the man sitting zip-tied on the curb. Agent Reynolds stepped forward, anticipating the secretary's movement. "Sir, the threat is neutralized. The suspect is in custody. The FBI has been mobilized." "Bring him here," Richard ordered softly. Reynolds hesitated for a fraction of a second, "But you don't deny the Secretary of Defense." He nodded to 2 CAD operators. They hauled Keller up by his armpits and dragged him over, forcing him to stand 3 feet in front of Richard Hayes. Keller was hyperventilating. Up close, the Secretary of Defense didn't look like a politician. He looked like a man deciding whether or not to authorize an airstrike. "Mr. Secretary, I didn't know," Keller stammered, his voice pathetic and reedy, completely devoid of the aggressive swagger he had used on Jordan earlier. "It was dark. He was wearing a hood. He matched a description. I was just doing my job." Richard stepped into Keller's personal space. The silence that fell over the group was suffocating. "You didn't know," Richard repeated, his voice barely above a whisper, making it infinitely more terrifying. "You didn't know he was my son, so you thought it was acceptable to drive his skull into the concrete." "Sir, he was resisting." "Do not lie to me." Richard's voice cracked like a whip echoing off the manicured houses. Even Sergeant Hendricks, standing yards away, flinched. "My detail has dashboard cameras. They have audio surveillance. They have night vision logs. I know exactly what you did to my boy. You saw a young black man walking in a neighborhood you decided he didn't belong in, and you wanted to break him." Richard leaned closer, his eyes boring into Keller's terrified soul. "You thought you were a predator tonight, officer. You thought you found easy prey," Richard whispered with venomous clarity. "But you dragged the wrong kid into the dark. I'm going to make sure you never wear a badge again. I'm going to make sure you never own a firearm again. And when the Department of Justice is finished dissecting your life, you are going to pray for a quiet cell." Before Keller could even attempt to formulate a response, the screech of tires signaled the arrival of a sleek black Dodge Charger. The chief of the county police, Alan Mercer, practically tumbled out of the driver's seat, his uniform hastily thrown on, sweat beading on his forehead. "Mr. Secretary? Mr. Secretary, please!" Chief Mercer gasped, jogging over, looking at Keller with absolute disgust. "I'm profoundly sorry. This officer will be suspended immediately pending a full internal affairs investigation." Richard cut him off without looking at him. "He isn't going to internal affairs, Chief Mercer. He isn't going to your local precinct. He is leaving in federal custody." "Sir, with all due respect, he's my officer. I have to process him." "He assaulted a federally protected person," Agent Reynolds intervened smoothly, stepping between the chief and the secretary. "Under 18 U.S. Code Section 112, that is a federal felony. Your jurisdiction ended the moment his knee touched the principal's back." Reynolds looked back at the tactical operators holding Keller. "Put him in the convoy. We're taking him to the FBI Washington field office." Keller's legs gave out. The operators had to literally drag him to the back of a black SUV. The door slammed shut, sealing him inside a dark, soundproof nightmare of his own making. The interrogation room at the FBI Washington field office was nothing like the dingy, coffee-stained interview rooms Keller was used to at his county precinct. This room was spotless, freezing cold, and terrifyingly silent. The walls were reinforced steel, painted a sterile eggshell white. A single camera in the corner glowed with a steady red light. Keller sat at the stainless steel table, his hands now cuffed to a heavy metal ring bolted to the floor. He'd been sitting alone for hours. The heavy metal door finally clicked open. Two men walked in. The first was Special Agent Marcus Rivera, a man with sharp features and a suit that cost more than Keller made in a month. He carried a thick, aggressively large manila folder. The second man made Keller's heart leap with a desperate, pathetic flare of hope. It was Frank Sullivan, the head of the local police union. If anyone could navigate a bad, excessive force claim, it was Sullivan. The union had saved Keller from previous troubles. "Frank, thank God," Keller breathed, gripping the edge of the table. "You got to get me out of here. This whole thing is a misunderstanding. It's totally blown out of proportion." Sullivan didn't look at Keller. He stood rigid, his face completely pale, clutching his briefcase against his chest like a shield. He looked like a man who had just been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Agent Rivera tossed the thick folder onto the table with a heavy thud. He didn't sit down. He just loomed over Keller. "Officer Brian Keller," Rivera said smoothly, opening the folder. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries. You are currently under arrest for violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 351, assaulting a major presidential appointee or their immediate family member. You are also being charged under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law." Keller scoffed weakly, looking at his union rep. "Frank, tell him I have qualified immunity. I was conducting a lawful stop based on reasonable suspicion." Sullivan finally looked at Keller, and the sheer pity and revulsion in his eyes made Keller's stomach drop. "Brian," Sullivan said, his voice raspy, "you don't have immunity. You don't have anything." "What are you talking about? The union? The union is formally withdrawing its legal representation of you as of 10 minutes ago," Sullivan said rapidly, as if the words burned his tongue. "The Fraternal Order of Police will not be funding your defense." Keller stared at him, stunned. "You can't do that. I pay my dues. You covered me on the Peterson complaint. You covered me when I broke that kid's jaw back then." Agent Rivera smiled a cold, predatory expression. "Ah, yes, the Peterson complaint and the incident a few years back. Funny you should mention those, Brian." Rivera began pulling documents from the folder, laying them out on the table like a dealer laying out a royal flush. "See, when you assaulted the son of the Secretary of Defense, the Secret Service didn't just call us to arrest you," Rivera explained softly. "They called the Department of Justice, specifically the Civil Rights Division, and the director of the FBI authorized a full retrospective deep dive into your entire career." Keller felt a cold sweat break out across his neck. "Those files are sealed. Internal Affairs cleared me." "Local Internal Affairs," Rivera corrected. "Federal subpoenas don't care about your local buddy system cover-ups. We have the hospital records. We have the suppressed dash cam footage from the Peterson stop that your sergeant accidentally deleted from the main server. We recovered it from the backups." Rivera leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You've been operating a one-man terror squad in that neighborhood for years, targeting minorities, escalating to violence, and hiding behind a badge. But you made a fatal mathematical error tonight. You assumed the kid on the street had less power than you." Keller's bravado shattered completely. He looked frantically at Sullivan. "Frank, please. They're trying to railroad me. You got to help me plead this down. I'll take a desk job. I'll resign." "Resign?" Sullivan laughed a bitter, hollow sound. "Brian, you're not getting a desk job. The DOJ just notified the chief. They are opening a pattern or practice investigation into the entire precinct because of you. The chief is throwing you to the wolves to save his own department. The mayor has already drafted a press release condemning you. You are radioactive." Sullivan turned to the door. "I'm only here as a courtesy to tell you you're on your own. Get a public defender, Brian. You're going to need one for the federal trial." "Frank, wait!" Keller screamed, rattling the cuffs against the steel ring as the union rep walked out the heavy metal door, slamming shut behind him. The click of the lock sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Agent Rivera slowly gathered the files, tapping them neatly against the table. "A federal felony assault charge carries up to 10 years in a federal penitentiary," Rivera noted conversationally. "Deprivation of rights under color of law adds another 10. And that's before we formally charge you with the civil rights violations from your past, which we are going to unearth piece by piece." Rivera walked to the door, placing his hand on the handle. "You wanted to be the biggest, toughest guy on the street tonight, Brian," Rivera said, not looking back. "Well, you're about to go to a federal prison filled with guys who are going to absolutely love meeting a dirty cop." The door opened and closed. The lights in the interrogation room dimmed slightly to their nighttime setting. Officer Brian Keller was left alone in the freezing silence. The badge he had hidden behind for years was sitting in an evidence bag down the hall. The union that protected him had abandoned him. The local command structure had offered him up as a sacrificial lamb. He looked down at the steel cuffs biting into his wrists. For the first time in his miserable, arrogant life, Brian Keller finally understood exactly what it felt like to be entirely helpless. Months later, the oppressive summer heat of Washington, D.C. shimmered above the pavement, baking the wide concrete steps of the E. Barrett Prettyman United States Courthouse. Outside, the air felt heavy enough to suffocate. Inside courtroom 24A, however, the temperature dropped to a sterile artificial chill, an environment as cold and unforgiving as the trial unfolding within it. Brian Keller sat at the defense table, but the man present bore little resemblance to the officer who once stalked the pristine streets of Potomac with unchecked authority. He had withered. The broad-shouldered arrogance had been replaced by a tense inward collapse. His once commanding presence had shrunk into something brittle and uncertain. The cheap gray suit draped awkwardly over his diminished frame, and his skin had taken on the pale, washed-out tone of someone who hadn't seen natural sunlight in months. Beside him sat Benjamin Croft, his court-appointed federal defender, flipping through legal notes with the quiet resignation of a man who understood the inevitable. There would be no miracle here, only procedure, evidence, and the slow dismantling of what remained. The courtroom was overflowing. Journalists packed shoulder to shoulder with activists, their pens and cameras poised to capture every moment. Civil rights leaders sat in rigid silence while a line of off-duty federal agents filled the back rows. Their presence alone was enough to shift the balance of power in the room. Every seat carried weight, every pair of eyes carried judgment. Directly behind the prosecution's table sat Jordan Hayes. Gone was the frightened teenager forced face down against cold pavement. In his place sat a composed young man in a tailored navy suit, his posture straight, his expression controlled. There was no visible anger, only a quiet, unshakable resolve. Next to him sat his father, Richard Hayes, the United States Secretary of Defense. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone altered the atmosphere, as though the room itself recognized authority at the highest level. At the front of the courtroom stood Jessica Hale of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Known across the country for dismantling institutional corruption with precise, methodical force, Hale carried herself with a calm that bordered on surgical. In her hand was a small black remote. She turned slightly toward the jury, her gaze steady, measured. Then she pressed the button. The screen behind her flickered to life, and in that moment, the case stopped being about testimony or argument. It became about evidence, cold, unavoidable, absolute. Keller's fate, already hanging by a thread, began to unravel completely. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Hale began, her voice echoing with crystalline clarity. For the past several days, the defense has desperately tried to paint a picture of a misunderstood public servant. Mr. Croft has argued that Officer Brian Keller was merely making a split-second, fear-based decision in a dark, unpredictable environment. They have asked you to believe that Officer Keller reasonably mistook an honor roll student for a dangerous burglary suspect who violently resisted arrest. Hale paused, turning her body slowly until her eyes locked directly onto Keller. The disgraced officer physically shrank back in his chair. The defense is banking on the historical precedent of these cases. They are hoping you will inherently believe the word of a veteran of the police force over a teenager walking home in the dark. They are hoping for ambiguity. Unfortunately for Mr. Keller, Hale continued, her tone dropping an octave, we do not have to rely on anyone's memory today. We possess the absolute, unvarnished, high-definition truth. She pointed the remote at the massive screens mounted around the courtroom and clicked a single button. The screens flared to life. It was not the grainy, heavily pixelated footage typically pulled from a standard police cruiser dashcam. This was military-grade, multispectral night vision footage, captured directly from the Secret Service Ford Expedition, idling a short distance down the street. The image was shockingly clear. The jury watched in stunned silence as Keller's cruiser violently swerved, cutting off Jordan on the sidewalk. They watched Keller leap out of the vehicle, his body language instantly aggressive and completely unprovoked. But it was the audio that drove the final unbreakable nail into Keller's coffin. The United States Secret Service does not merely protect its principals with firearms, Hale explained softly over the playing video. They utilize state-of-the-art parabolic microphones to monitor the acoustic perimeter from hundreds of yards away. Listen very closely to the split-second fear-based decision of Officer Keller. The audio track crackled to life. The jury clearly heard Jordan politely and calmly state his constitutional rights. Then they heard Keller's response. It wasn't just the aggressive shouting that condemned him. The hypersensitive microphone had picked up exactly what Keller muttered under his breath as he unclipped his heavy steel handcuffs. "Think you own the place, little punk? I'm going to teach you a lesson." A collective, visceral gasp ripped through the gallery. Several jurors physically recoiled. It was not a tense police stop gone wrong. It was a targeted, premeditated assault driven by pure, unadulterated racial malice. The footage continued, showing Keller violently sweeping Jordan's legs out from under him and dropping his entire body weight squarely onto the teenager's spine. "Where's the resistance?" Hale asked the jury, pausing the video frame exactly as Keller's knee drove into Jordan's back. "Where's the sudden threat? The only danger on that street was the man wearing the badge enforcing his own corrupted version of the law." When the prosecution called Secretary Richard Hayes to the stand, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. He walked to the witness box with the imposing posture of a four-star general, his eyes completely bypassing the defense table, looking right through Brian Keller as if the man were nothing more than a stain on the floorboards. Benjamin Croft looked physically nauseated as he stood to cross-examine the Secretary of Defense. He knew he was walking into a complete slaughter. "Mr. Secretary," Croft began, his voice wavering slightly, desperately trying to find a foothold. "Is it not true that on the night in question, your son was wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt, walking late at night in a neighborhood that had recently experienced a documented string of property thefts?" Richard Hayes did not raise his voice. He simply leaned forward into the microphone, his deep, gravelly tone commanding absolute silence. "Mr. Croft, my son was wearing a sweatshirt because it was cool outside. He was walking home from a high school study session. He was unarmed. He was polite. And he was fully compliant. If the entirety of your defense relies on criminalizing a black teenager for the sheer act of wearing a piece of clothing in his own neighborhood, then you possess no defense at all." Croft swallowed hard, visibly sweating under the glare of the gallery. "But Officer Keller didn't know he was your son, sir. He didn't know about the federal detail. He was treating him as he would any unknown, potentially dangerous suspect on the street." "That," Richard Hayes stated, his voice dropping to a low, devastating rumble that sent chills down the spines of the jury, "is precisely the tragedy of this entire case, Counselor. He didn't know Jordan was the son of a cabinet secretary. He thought Jordan was a nobody. He thought Jordan was an isolated target without a voice, without political power, and without legal recourse. Officer Keller operated under the cowardly, malignant assumption that he could brutalize a child on the pavement, and the system would blindly protect him exactly as it had done for years." Richard finally turned his piercing gaze directly to the defense table. Keller physically shrank back in his chair, shutting his eyes in terror. "My son survived that night because he had a heavily armed federal tactical detail waiting in the shadows," Richard stated, absolute conviction ringing in every syllable. The terrifying question this jury must answer is, what would Officer Keller have done to my boy if those federal agents hadn't been there? Furthermore, what has he already done to the countless other victims who didn't have the United States government waiting down the block to save them? Croft stood frozen for 5 agonizing seconds. He looked at the jury, whose faces were set in absolute stone. He looked at his client, who was openly weeping into his hands. "I have no further questions, Your Honor," Croft mumbled, practically collapsing back into his chair. The defense rested their case immediately afterward without calling a single witness to the stand. They had absolutely nothing left to offer but the impending ruin of Brian Keller. The heavy oak door to the jury deliberation room remained sealed shut for a short time. In the realm of federal civil rights trials, a deliberation under an hour wasn't just fast. It was an absolute, unapologetic execution. Inside courtroom 24A, the suffocating tension had settled over the gallery like a heavy wool blanket. The air conditioning hummed, blasting frigid air across the polished mahogany pews, but Brian Keller was sweating profusely. His cheap off-the-rack gray suit clung to his damp shoulders. He sat perfectly still at the defense table, his eyes locked onto the ticking second hand of the wall clock. Every click felt like a hammer striking his sternum. Beside him, Benjamin Croft, the exhausted federal public defender, wasn't even pretending to review his notes anymore. In a move that sent a wave of absolute terror through Keller's veins, Croft had already begun quietly packing his legal pads and pens into his battered leather briefcase. Croft had been in the federal system long enough to know what a sub-hour deliberation meant. The jury hadn't debated the evidence. They had merely sat down, poured a cup of coffee, and signed the conviction papers. "All rise!" The bailiff's voice boomed, shattering the tense silence. Judge Edward Caldwell emerged from chambers, his black robes billowing slightly as he took his seat at the elevated bench. Caldwell was a jurist who didn't suffer fools, and his expression was carved out of granite. He nodded to the bailiff, who unsealed the door to the deliberation room. The 12 men and women of the jury filed back into the box. Not a single one of them looked at Brian Keller. That was the second universal sign of doom. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Caldwell asked, his voice echoing clearly across the cavernous room. The foreperson, a retired middle school principal named Martha Higgins, stood up. She adjusted her glasses, holding the single sheet of paper with a steady, unwavering hand. "We have, Your Honor." Keller felt his throat close up. He tried to swallow, but his mouth was filled with the taste of dry ash and supper. His knees began to tremble violently beneath the table. "On the first count of the indictment," Martha Higgins read, her voice ringing out with piercing clarity, "deprivation of rights under color of law, resulting in bodily injury. We find the defendant, Brian Keller, guilty." A sharp collective intake of breath swept through the gallery, but the judge's swift strike of the gavel maintained absolute order. Keller's vision tunneled. "On the second count," Higgins continued, completely unfazed, "assaulting an immediate family member of a United States official. We find the defendant guilty." Keller's legs finally gave out. He collapsed heavily into his heavy wooden chair, his forehead coming to rest on the cold mahogany table. He let out a pathetic, broken sob that carried through the silent room, a sound devoid of dignity, completely lacking the aggressive swagger he had wielded on the streets of Potomac. It was the sound of a bully who had finally been dragged into the light. At the sentencing hearing, the courtroom transformed from a site of judgment into a site of absolute systemic destruction. Keller was brought in wearing a bright orange federal jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles bound by heavy steel transport chains that clinked loudly with every shuffling step. He looked like a hollowed-out shell of a human being. The pre-trial detention had stripped away the last remnants of his arrogance, leaving only a terrified, pale man who jumped at his own shadow. In the front row of the gallery, Jordan Hayes sat shoulder to shoulder with his father, Secretary of Defense Richard Hayes, and Agent Michael Reynolds. Jordan wore a sharp navy suit, his posture straight, the physical abrasions on his face long healed, though the memory of the pavement remained. Judge Edward Caldwell looked down from the bench, a thick stack of manila folders resting before him. "Mr. Keller," Judge Caldwell began, his voice devoid of any warmth or sympathy, "over the past weeks, this court has reviewed your personnel files, the pre-sentencing reports, and the victim impact statements. Your actions on that night were abhorrent, You weaponized the authority granted to you by the state, turning a badge into an instrument of racial malice and cowardice. Caldwell paused, removing his reading glasses and locking his gaze directly onto the trembling former officer. But what this court, and indeed the Department of Justice, found equally disturbing was the systemic rot that allowed a predator like you to thrive. Caldwell continued, the volume of his voice rising slightly, commanding the absolute attention of every reporter in the room. You assumed you were operating in a vacuum. You thought the blue wall of silence would protect you from a teenage boy you deemed insignificant. Instead, you triggered a federal avalanche. Keller looked up, his bloodshot eyes widening in confusion. As a direct result of the federal investigation triggered by your arrest, Caldwell declared, Operation Shattered Shield was launched by the FBI. Federal arrest warrants were executed at your former precinct at dawn. Sergeant Hendricks and several other officers you colluded with over the years are currently in federal custody, indicted for conspiracy, falsifying official reports, and civil rights violations. Chief Alan Mercer has been forced into immediate resignation and is under federal investigation. A shockwave of murmurs ripped through the press pool. Keller's jaw dropped. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He hadn't just ruined his own life. His singular act of racist arrogance had completely dismantled the entire corrupt brotherhood that had shielded him. He was now universally hated by the very men he used to call his brothers. You did not just betray the public trust, Mr. Keller, Judge Caldwell stated, his voice ringing with terrifying finality. You poisoned the well of justice. Law enforcement officers are the ultimate shield of a civilized society. You chose to be its absolute worst nightmare. You targeted a child relying on a corrupt system to bury the truth. Caldwell picked up his heavy wooden gavel. There will be no leniency today. There will be no desk duty, and there will be no early release. The judge said, his eyes narrowed. It is the judgment of this United States District Court that you, Brian Keller, be remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons for a term of 25 years to be served consecutively with absolutely no possibility of parole. Take him away, Caldwell ordered, slamming the gavel down with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. The United States Marshals did not hesitate. They didn't use the polite escort procedures reserved for white-collar criminals. Two massive, heavily armored deputies grabbed Keller roughly by his biceps, hoisting him violently to his feet. They tightened the belly chains around his waist, the heavy steel biting into his sides. As they dragged him toward the heavy wooden doors leading to the holding cells, Keller desperately turned his head over his shoulder. He looked toward the gallery. He didn't see anger in Jordan Hayes' eyes. He didn't see triumphant vindication. He saw something infinitely worse to a man who craved dominance. He saw complete, dismissive pity. Jordan simply held his gaze for 2 seconds, a quiet, immovable testament of strength, before turning away to speak to his father. Keller was no longer a threat. He was just a pathetic footnote in a sealed federal file. The marshals shoved Keller through the side doors. The transition was instantaneous and brutal. He was thrust from the bright, polished mahogany of the courtroom into a freezing concrete windowless corridor that smelled of ammonia and despair. Karma hadn't just caught up with Brian Keller. It had utterly annihilated him, utilizing the full crushing weight of the United States federal government to do it. The heavy reinforced steel door of the holding area slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed down the long, dark hallway like a vault ceiling shut forever, plunging federal inmate number 84729-016 into a long nightmare of his own making. What happened to Officer Brian Keller is a stark, powerful reminder that absolute arrogance is blinding, and karma rarely misses its mark. When those in power abuse their authority, believing they are entirely untouchable and shielded by corrupt systems, reality has a devastating way of balancing the scales. Keller chose to prey on a teenager he thought was powerless, completely unaware that he had triggered the wrath of the federal government and exposed his entire precinct's toxic culture. Justice wasn't just served, it fundamentally dismantled the very shadows he hid within. Jordan Hayes survived to tell his story, proving that the truth, no matter how hard someone tries to bury it, will always find the light. If this story of ultimate karma and justice kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button, share this with your friends, and subscribe for more intense real-life dramas. Drop a comment below. Did the judge give him enough? In the quiet streets of a wealthy neighborhood, one moment of arrogance and racial bias turned a teenager's walk home into a nightmare that exposed the darkest side of authority. This story is a heartbreaking reminder that when we abuse power, believing ourselves untouchable, we invite a reckoning that can shatter everything we hold dear. Officer Keller's decision to brutalize an innocent young man didn't just end his career, it dismantled an entire web of corruption and forced him to face the cold reality of his choices. At its core, the tale reveals a profound truth about life. No one is above accountability. Jordan's dignified resistance and his father's fierce protection show the unbreakable strength that comes from integrity and standing up for what is right. It teaches us that empathy and respect are not weaknesses, but the only forces that keep us from becoming the monsters we fear. This powerful story challenges us to look beyond appearances, to question our assumptions before we act, and to remember that every person carries a story we cannot see. The father's raw fury and the son's quiet courage remind us that love and justice can overcome even the most entrenched systems of abuse. If this story left you reflecting on the real cost of prejudice and the triumph of integrity, share your thoughts in the comments below. What lesson hit you hardest, or what would you have done in that moment? Hit the like button if it moved you, share it with friends who need this reminder, and subscribe to the channel with notifications on, so you never miss these stories that prove truth and karma always prevail.